Hello, and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm Erica, and we've got Jeff, Steve, Cameron,
Hello.
and our friend Mason, who is calling from his car in a parking lot. Woo!
Hello.
Secretly homeless.
Secretly homeless.
No longer a secret.
I'm out, guys.
If you see Mason on a street corner near you, please be kind.
Give him a
Please. $20, $10, $5, $1, a quarter, whatever floats the boat.
Anything helps.
Starving artist is a thing for a reason.
Right.
All right, so today we're going to be talking about how to write characters who are sheltered. And I proposed this episode idea because I just finished reading this book that I really loved. It's called Palace of Lies by Margaret Peterson Haddix. Oh dear, it's blurry in my Zoom background. But anyway, so the book starts off with this 14-year-old princess who has never seen the sky before. She's been raised inside this palace. She's never been outside of it. And she has this evil advisor who keeps her under his thumb. And when she's 14, the palace burns down and she has to go on the run to her neighboring country, but she has no functional skills and doesn't know how to survive in real life. And one of my favorite things that I think was pretty daring of the author to do, but would definitely be realistic of somebody raised in that situation, is because she's never been outside and she's never seen the sky before. The first time she sees the sky, she has this panic attack and starts screaming to the point that one of her attendants abandons her and doesn't want to help her get to the neighboring kingdom anymore. And so the rest of her traveling companions resort to carrying her on a stretcher with a sheet over her face so she can't scream anymore and they can keep her quiet and they don't get discovered. And I thought that was a really bold take, but definitely authentic to that situation. And I think sheltered characters are a lot of fun to work with, because if they're sheltered from a magical world like Harry Potter is at the start of the Harry Potter series, then you get to see this new and exciting world through the eyes of somebody who's just as new to it as you are. And then if you're writing a character who's sheltered from our world, you could get to see some very ordinary things in a way that are new and exciting. So I just want to open that up to the group and ask, what characters have you seen that are sheltered in books or other media that you've liked?
Truman Show springs to mind, where that's an interesting one, because it's not that he is unfamiliar with most things in real life, just that he's not actually living real life. And so that one actually misses a lot of that sort of sheltered aspect, but we then see him as sheltered because we know he's not living in a real world, which is sort of a strange take on it that misses a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, but still hits some of the same notes.
But he does have that same drive that a lot of shelter characters do. He wants to get out, he wants to go sailing around the world. So I think that's another commonality with a lot of shelter characters. There's this consistent desire for escape, or at least just to get out more.
Just to kind of go in a slightly different direction with kind of the reluctant one, of course, being a big Wheel of Time fan that I am, I think Edmonds Field is a very sheltered, small town that we've got these various young heroes living in, and they, hear stories about Trollocs and other things, or even Aes Sedai and Warders. And so we get this very sheltered feel from them in the initial chapters when people are coming in and talking about what's happening with wars in cities. They're even sheltered from the idea of, war and stuff. And so that is a very fun one to me. But I think you point out something really awesome by bringing this up, Erica, that really anytime someone lacks knowledge about something and then they are exposed to it, we are getting that shelter from that type of knowledge. And I think that is a pretty common thing, whether it's living in a small town and then moving out, or a magic system, or like the Harry Potters you're saying. So I think there are lots of opportunities, because initially when you brought it up, I was like, sheltered characters, what do I know about? And then I was like, oh yeah, and I read tons of stories like that. So I think it is much more ubiquitous than I first was even thinking.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of overlap.
Sorry, Steve, you go.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of overlap with just the idea of fish out of water characters, which is a pretty classic thing to use to be able to introduce your reader. Your reader gets to go on the discovery with the fish out of water character. I think what's kind of interesting about that, and I'd be interested to hear a little bit more, Erica, about this book you were talking about, because I have not read that, but there seems to be more recently a bit of a danger in doing that, or like having these naive characters it was like a trope for a long time, from kind of like Splash up to Fifth Element, Little Mermaid, or any of these things where you have this female protagonist who doesn't know anything, and like it almost was like, I think a lot of it's been cast back, looking back on it, as like male fantasy, you know, that you could sort of like trip into. And so I was kind of interested in like where that goes in the book that you were talking about, and if anybody's ever found pitfalls to that idea of having this sheltered, naive character.
One point I want to bring up with gender, and then I'm
Yeah,
going to turn it over to Mason. Or Mason, if you have a comment, you can go.
Yeah, I was just going to say really quick, I think one of the aspects of all of that is the kind of sexualization aspect of that, if that makes sense, right? Like, I think I'm going to refer to Frozen here, even though, and I'm going to get backlash because of this, but I'm going to take it. I'm going to take it. I've never watched Frozen, and I don't want to, candidly, but I do think that they pull this off, right? Where they kind of lampshade that whole phenomenon, right? Because I haven't watched Frozen, I'm going to guess at the younger sister's name. I believe it's Anna, but she's got her suitor, right? Who basically takes advantage of her naivete, and tries to fill the role of the guiding patriarch that so many individuals in this particular trope have filled in the past. But they kind of pull it off, revealing it to be a villainous thing on his part, right? But then also revealing that it is possible for people to help naive people without it being intrinsically villainous or like kind of power dynamic sexuality stuff, right? I mean, Kristoff helps Anna and is a totally okay guy, and also like kind of gives some advisory aspects to Anna, helping her to come to terms with the world outside of her castle. Her sister also kind of helps teach Anna, right? Elsa helps teach Anna. And I think that's maybe part of it, right? I think that naive characters can be written well, and can also be informed by people around them, even in kind of like masculine, feminine relationships. But I think that some aspects of this in the past have played off of sexuality in an unhealthy fashion.
You're just totally lying that you haven't seen Frozen, right?
I have not. I've never seen it. But everyone talks about it and sings the songs and everything, so I know the whole dang thing.
Steve, homeless people don't have TVs.
Ouch.
And in all sincerity, really quick, for someone watching this in the future, I'm not homeless. I don't want to make light of homelessness. Help homeless people, please. You know, all that stuff. But yeah.
We should be very clear. We would never make fun of that life situation. We're just making fun of Mason. That's all that's happening.
In any and every way possible.
And I deserve being made fun of constantly.
No, just about Frozen. That's the only thing. that's the only one. Saying you haven't watched it, but you know everything about it.
Okay, speaking of princesses, I'm glad you connected it back to princesses there again, Mason, because one of the things I love about this book so much is that it's a deconstruction of what a princess classic would be if you never let her out of the castle and you never got to let her meet normal people. Because I think a lot of the recent decades have been moving away from the princess classic stereotypes by just completely throwing them out of the window and, oh, we're going to have a rebel princess, she's a warrior, but we've seen a lot of those to the point where that's a cliche. I like it because it deconstruction shows this is exactly how messed up a person would be if they had to grow up like that. And Jeff, I think it was you who brought up gender a minute ago. One thing I've seen in a lot of sheltered female characters, and I think there's two main types of sheltered female characters who've never interacted with a man. That's a trope a lot of people seem to like, because you get to see this girl meet her first man, and then of course they fall in love, very first man, and it's insta love, okay, whatever. And I think there's two main types of those characters. Some where they're raised Rapunzel style, where they have their mother Gothel and they never interacted with anybody other than their mom. And then you have your Wonder Woman and the Amazons characters who know a lot of people, they just only know women. And in every book and every movie I've ever seen where a girl meets her first man, they all know how to use male pronouns. And like, obviously you can hear stories about men and from the other woman, and you can know that he and him are pronouns that exist, but you don't have practice using them, then you're going to slip up in the first few times. And I think there's potential for comedy in there. You have this girl who goes, oh yes, I found a man, I've fallen in love. She's a great man.
Yeah, you approach something really interesting there, Erica, which is like, what are the real actual day-to-day troubles that you would run into if you had not been exposed to the real world? You can actually, there's actually a fantastic example of this if you want to take it sheltered to its greatest extreme. I talk about it in my psychology classes sometimes when we talk about language development. There is actually, you can find YouTube videos of a woman named Jeannie who was actually a feral child found locked in the closet of her grandparents' house in the 60s, if I'm remembering correctly. She had been horribly abused. Her grandparents were her caretakers. The mom and dad were out of the picture for a reason that I don't recall. And the grandparents had literally locked her in the closet and chained her to a chair for her entire life. She had never been spoken to. They would throw in food to her once a day. There was a pot underneath this chair that had been sawn out. The middle of the chair had been sawn out so that she could go to the bathroom. Awful, horrible situation. The grandparents were arrested for some other reason, and she was then taken into the care of the state. She didn't know how to walk. She didn't know how to speak. She didn't know how to feed herself. She didn't know how to bathe, any of it. And so she had to be taught how to be human. And so she was given into the care of a set of psychologists who then taught her how to be human. And there's videos of her training sessions and a lot of some documentaries that were written and whatnot, where you can actually see some of her progress. And it's very interesting from a psychological perspective in terms of her ability to learn language and all sorts of other things. Now, recent stories have suggested that perhaps some of these psychologists were not exactly entirely forthcoming or honest in their presentation of Jeannie and some of the things that she was able and not able to learn. And so there's some questions there still. But if you're talking about someone learning how to be a person, how to deal with the real world after being sheltered, that's sort of the perfect iteration of that, where this was someone who had no experience with anybody and then had to learn how to be human.
Yeah. And I think, Cameron, I love what you just said. I had a thought in mind and I'm struggling to figure out a smooth way to transition between the two. I'm definitely going to look at that story. I'm definitely going to look up that story after this, though, because that is fascinating, tremendously tragic.
Yeah.
And I do think it highlights that there are actual like real life scenarios that can be referred to here, right? I have family members of my own, not going to be named for privacy's sake, who were neglected for the first number of months of their life, right? Formative parts of the life, and remain psychologically impacted to this day, right? In some instances, they were only neglected for, maybe 8 months or so of the first year of their life. And then the rest of their life, they've been in caring homes. But nonetheless, the psychological impact remains. And so I think that also plays off of another thing, right? Like what kind of sheltering are we talking about here? Are we talking about just being left in a castle, or are we talking about no one speaking to them? I think another idea that I've had in mind for a while now with fantasy stuff, I wonder how many dwarves are agoraphobes, right? Like if they're underground their whole lives and they come out and there's this huge blue thing above them, how would they react to that? How would they react to open spaces? And by contrast, right? Like, are centaurs prone to like, oh my gosh, I'm totally going to forget, claustrophobia. Are centaurs prone to claustrophobia? These are other aspects of like sheltering, right? Where it's not that you haven't experienced the world, you've just only experienced certain parts of it, which at the end of it is all sheltering is. And I think those aspects of things, how do the different kind of sheltered aspects of different groups impact their psyche as they're exposed to other aspects of the world?
Speaking of the psychological and linguistic development, there's another famous case study I want to bring up. There's a book you can read about this. It's called The Miracle and the Tragedy of the Dionne Quintuplets by Sarah Miller. And it's a case study of the first 5 quintuplets to be born alive. They're born in Canada in the 1930s. The Canadian government went, oh, wait, we have 5 babies and they're just born way prematurely and their parents are poor, so they can't raise them. So we're just going to seize them, take them into the state custody, province custody, whatever Canada has, and we're going to build a tourist attraction called Quintland, and we're going to have spectators come in and look at these 5 babies, toddlers, 9-year-olds behind a one-way mirror, and they'll just be raised in complete isolation from everybody, including their biological family, and they stayed there until they were 9. Like, from what I read from this book, they got to leave once in those 9 years to go on a field trip because the King of England was visiting Canada and he wanted to meet these kids. But other than that, they never saw other people, so the only kids they know are each other, and the only adults they know are these nurses and doctors taking care of them, so they didn't need words, because if you're quintuplets, I'm sure you kind of get each other, and they've never been apart from each other, so they know everything about their sisters, and the nursery runs on the strict schedule, so they know what time they're getting food. There's certain times they're on display to the public who they can't see. And there's this point in their toddlerhood when they were supposed to have a vocabulary of a couple hundred words, and the 5 of them had this collective vocabulary of 75. Because if you don't see new things, if you don't talk about new things, there's not really any reason to use words at all.
Can I just say for a second that I'm so glad that it's not just our government that does awful, horrendous things. Just throwing that out there.
Well, this is like a modern bias, but I hear stories like this and I get the feeling like people in the past were just deeply, deeply crazy. Like people had to sign off, right? Some bureaucracy had to go like, yeah, this is a good idea. I'm with it.
This has been a very educational
Seriously, I feel like the takeaway message of this like the takeaway message of this video is we live in a just very messed up world, yeah. Right?
My comments were going to be along the lines of, I was giving an example of a reluctant shelter person, someone that wanted to stay in the shelter. They don't want to go out and give adventures, which is a writing thing, which compared to these other stories, who cares? And then my other thing that I keep thinking about is, in the story you mentioned, Erica, I'm wondering how they're keeping that protagonist active, because if she's just laying on a stretcher with something over her eyes, she's not getting to do a lot. And so I'm wondering how they're keeping reader interest. But then these other things go. So I'm like, from a writing perspective, I'm like, quintuplets trapped by government, what? So, I don't even know anymore.
I was going to say, from a writing perspective, because this is what we're supposed to be doing, right? I think one of the things that often gets neglected when you're dealing with somebody exposed to a new aspect of the world is initial shock. You know, you get a scene or two of, oh, what's that loud thing going past me on the street? And then it's never really mentioned again because the character is assumed to have acclimated to the new world. I think smart writing, though, would find 1 or 2 things, subtle things, where the person does not acclimate, does not get used to, something that they continue to struggle with. And it doesn't need to be tragic, it doesn't have to be awful, but something that continues to tell you who they are and where they've come from, and that can influence the way that they move through the world. I think that's real smart writing, and something we all ought to be thinking about when we have characters going into some new context.
Yeah, I second that, Cameron. And my instinct is that this is an easy thing to mess up when you're writing, because the author, of course, has not been sheltered. So it's probably hard to know what you take for granted. Like, you are the fish in the water, right? You are not aware of the water that you're swimming in. So you're not always going to be aware of, like, oh, what would somebody coming into this environment from somewhere completely else take for granted? What would they not? What would they, so it tends to be what you said. There's like a couple big obvious things that the person's like, whoa, cars or something. But then like, it would maybe be much more profound than that. And I don't know if I've read something that really tackled it almost to that sort of level.
Yeah.
I mean, I think
you go, Jeff.
So I was going to say, I think perfection exists in the realm of Crocodile Dundee. I think if we're going to look at one flawless example, no, but in seriousness, I agree. I think it would be good to be keeping an eye on that. And I think that's just something to, depending on the type of writer you are, to potentially track. And I just got two quick ideas. One is that I think a lot of times when we're coming in and talking about a character and you're figuring out who your character is, whether you figured out beforehand or as you write it, you're eventually coming up with a character who has a particular viewpoint. And that's hard enough in and of itself. Just figure out like, how does my character view the world in a slightly different way, whether they're sheltered or not. But what we're talking about with sheltering, you're actually building that character in the moment. Like you're creating this new habit or perspective in the moment for the person that then is lasting with them. So I think it's just an interesting conversation about characters who come in that are mostly set and they've got their reactions that they do and that's who they are. And maybe they got a big thing they change about in their arc. But we're talking about like little things that you're making the character as you go because they are now exposed to the world. And then the other thing about tracking that I was mentioning is in other videos we talk about that you can plan sort of like arcs. And it feels like this could be one thing you could potentially plan. I mean, not as in depth maybe, but just to say like, okay, these are going to be the initial things that the person reacts to. And these are the ones that are going to stick with them in this particular way. And it does just feel like you got a bit more character work to do if you're writing that person that's more outside of yourself, like Steve was saying.
What I was going to say, all of this conversation, sorry, I definitely heard someone else speak, so I apologize for cutting someone off. During all of this conversation, I've thought a lot about a friend of mine that I had when I was younger. This particular friend and I, many of our viewers may not know, I served a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. White shirts, tags, the whole gig. And at one point I had a companion that was dealing with a lot of different kind of mental health stuff and also had lived a very sheltered life. Had anxiety, was autistic, and also was OCD. And as you may or may not know, a lot of missionaries for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints ride bikes. Well, this particular elder could not ride a bike when there was a car on the road because he got very afraid, understandably so, due to his various conditions that he was dealing with. And so there was kind of this expectation. I would keep an eye out whenever there was a car coming. And if a car came, I would get over to the side of the road and brake because he was going to do that because he was very scared, right? Eventually, this particular missionary reached a point where he was able to keep going in spite of the cars, but he was still very, very afraid in the process. But he would keep going so that we could keep moving. I think that may be something that kind of misses from the formula with these kinds of stories, is the car passes and they're like, oh, what is that? And then next time a car passes, they're just totally used to it, right? Whereas in my experience with people that are dealing with mental illness and also dealing with a shut-in lifestyle, they usually don't stop being scared about these things for like prolonged periods of time, if they ever stop being scared of them. But eventually just become more acclimated to the fear to be able to continue functioning in spite of it. Which may be kind of a different paradigm, different perspective that could be useful to have.
Thank you, Mason, for sharing that. And I think that ties into another reason that shelter characters are so fun to write is because you get to see their arc. You get to see people going from, I can't ride a bike, I can't go anywhere without a stretcher over my face, to I know how to apply problem solving skills to everyday life like other people do. And for that reason, I think even though they're tricky to pull off, even though you have to take in a lot of factors, into account, from vocabulary to interactions with the opposite gender to dangerous situations that the rest of us would find ordinary, like a car driving past. I think shelter characters are very rewarding to write. And I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this episode, but this has been the Writer's Block, and we'll see you next week, Blockheads.